yes, in the last 8 years, I have grave concern. I'm a former finance minister. I have grave
Right.
concerns that the NDP government has more than doubled our provincial debt to over $100 billion. The projected deficit just for the upcoming year is projected to be almost $8 billion, which would be the largest deficit in British Columbia history. And there's no plan. They can't even tell you when they might even get back to balanced budgets. So we will have deficits as far as the eye can see. But that is not the most concerning part. The most concerning part to me is that it is tied to the worst results we've ever seen.
Hello, I'm John Brink, and we are podcasting On The Brink from downtown Prince George, British Columbia, Canada. And today is a very, very special day for us, is that because our guest is Kevin Falcon, who is an individual quite involved in fact, he is the official opposition leader of the BC United Party in British Columbia. And around the world, we have all kinds of elections. We had it in France, we had it in, obviously we see elections in the United States, and we have an election in British Columbia on October the 19th. And it's going to be an interesting one. There are a number of parties, and we are bringing the leaders of those parties on our podcast to share with our guests, not only in BC, but in Canada and the rest of the world, how the political system evolves in British Columbia. So Kevin, I've known Kevin for a long time. He's a member of an MLA of the Vancouver-Quilchena official, and he's the official opposition leader of the BC United Party. United Party used to be the known as the BC Liberal Party, and you changed the name about 6 months ago, 8 months ago, a year ago, Kevin?
Yeah, just over a year ago, we changed the name through a membership vote of over 80% to change the name to BC United. And the main reason is, for those of your viewers that might not be from British Columbia, it was because our name is the same name as a federal party called the Liberal Party of Canada, even though we had no formal connection to that party. A bit of a unique thing in British Columbia. We have a couple of provincial parties, the BC Liberal Party, now called BC United, and we wanted to call it BC United because we did want to be a party that unites people together, but also is not officially seen to be connected to any federal party, which we never have been, but there was a perception issue. And so too with the other provincial party here, the BC Conservative Party, also has the same name as the Federal Conservative Party, but there's no affiliation between the two. But it does create confusion, there's no doubt.
Yes, and then the other parties that we have is the NDP party, which is somewhat left of center, and then we have the Greens, which stands for itself, obviously. Now, with you were initially elected in 2001 when Gordon Campbell then became Premier of the province, and you were one of the youngest MLAs, and I believe you then represented Surrey-Cloverdale in 2001.
Yeah, so that's correct. I was elected in 2001 with Gordon Campbell, one of the largest sweeps of electoral victories in BC history. We won 77 out of 79 seats, and my first job in cabinet was the minister responsible for meeting one of our signature commitments we made while we were in opposition, while Gord was the opposition leader, was to reduce unnecessary red tape and regulatory burden by 1/3 in our first 3 years. And I'm very proud of the fact that we exceeded that target and actually hit 42% reduction in unnecessary red tape.
And then the other part is that you became active as an MLA, as one of the youngest one, but had several portfolios, including Deputy Premier of the province, which was somewhat amazing, really, for somebody.
Yeah. Well, I got older as we went through the 12 years, but I was after I was Minister of Deregulation and Cutting Red Tape. My next job was Minister of Transportation, which I proudly served for just over 6 years. One of the longest-serving ministers of transportation, right behind Flying Phil Gallardi and Alex Fraser.
Yeah.
Then I served as a Minister of Health for a couple of years, and I ended my career as Deputy Premier and Minister of Finance before I went back into the private sector for another 10 years.
So then you were back into the private sector. You did a number of things there in real estate, finance, and all of those kind of things, and were involved in numerous companies. And then you decided again to go back into politics in British Columbia. And that was in...
That's right.
Which election was that? Was it 20?
Well, that was just 2 years ago. So I had to run in a by-election to win the seat of our former leader, Andrew Wilkinson, who generously stepped aside after he had the election loss in the 2020 election. And then I ran for leadership of the party against a number of other contenders. And when I won that, I then had to run to get back in the legislature. And I won a very commanding victory with over 60% of the vote in the riding of Vancouver-Quilchena. And that's how I became a member of the Legislative Assembly and the official leader of the opposition.
So a lot of your life has been directly, and I've known you for probably more than 20 years, I believe, if not more than that, and in politics and as a friend. And then at the same point, you were involved here in one of the podcasts that I did, number 84. It was about a year and a half ago or so. And talking in particular about the forest industry, and obviously our podcast now will be different. It will deal also with the forest industry, but other issues. But you're really been involved in politics for a long, long time. Starting in 2001, it is well in excess of 20 years, and then. Politics is difficult and challenging and very, very demanding. A lot of people are not fully, respectfully, appreciative what is all involved in it, especially if you're a party leader or a minister. It is extremely demanding, very hard on families in a lot of cases. You got married, I believe it was in 2010, to Jessica, and they again have to be very supportive of the husband that is always under pressure and traveling, and I believe you have 2 daughters as well, the 2 young daughters, and so it can be very, very hard on families.
It can be, for sure, and it's one of the main reasons I retired from public life. When I announced my retirement in 2012. My wife was pregnant at that point with our second daughter, Rose, who's now 11. My eldest is 14. And, spending 10 years back in the private sector, although that's a different kind of stress and busyness, at least I'm home most evenings. And I really treasure that 10 years that I had to really spend time with my wife, Jessica, helping our kids raise our kids.
At such a critical time, right?
Absolutely. And that was a really important part of my thinking. But the reason I came back to politics, which perplexed a lot of my friends, especially in the business community, they couldn't believe that I would leave the position I had to go back to politics, was really for the same reason I left. It was because of my children, not them specifically, but their generation. I was very, very concerned about the direction I saw government going in here in British Columbia. I saw a lot of the same mistakes that the NDP made in the 1990s were being replicated again. And that really worsened when John Horgan retired. I had to retire for health reasons. And David Eby came in as the new leader of the NDP party and really took the party even further to the left. Very much a socialist mindset that BC simply can't afford.
So and you mentioned, just for our guests that are watching us, one opposition leader in particular that became government, and initially at a minority basis, where he had a minority government, but then called an election that won a clear majority for the NDP under the leadership of John Oregon. And the amazing part about John Oregon, I'm independent, but I had a great deal of respect for John Oregon, and amazingly, for a leader of in BC, the difference between leaning right and left is quite distinct. But I have seldom in the 60 years that I've been here, always close to understanding politics, seen a relationship between the two opposing parties as close as they were with John Oregon. And and was respected by the opposition leaders like yourself as well. And unfortunately, due to health reasons, had to retire. And for about a year ago now, David Eby became the premier.
That's right. So the way it works in a parliamentary system is if the leader leaves, as the premier did, and retired and moved on, then the party itself has an internal leadership race. Whoever wins that becomes the premier. So David Eby is the premier, though he's never been voted or elected yet as a premier leading a party. That will come on October the 19th of this year. But yes, you're right. That's what happened. And I agree with you, actually. I do think that John Oregon was more of the old style NDP leaders that still had an understanding of the importance of natural resources and that weren't wildly irresponsible when it comes to fiscal management. But all semblance of that old NDP really went out the window with David Eby, who is an urban, he's a Vancouver guy, and worked for the Pivot Legal Society, radicalized that group very dramatically, wrote a book called How to Sue the Police, then went on to the BC Civil Liberties Association, where he called for the legalization of all illicit drugs, and very much is pushing a very urban agenda that, frankly, has been not great for big swaths of the province.
So looking at other areas, where politics is become extremely important in terms of what direction we go. I'm watching the United States always closely too, because we are so closely connected to them, not getting politically involved, but watching it with interest in particular as to what happens in differences of opinion and direction and the critical importance of that. And so what I'm seeing with the left of center in particular, and I agree with you, with John Oregon was left of center, but not to the damaging industry and investment and confidence in the province. That has somewhat changed under David Eby, and in particular, what I'm concerned about is that I believe when Eby took over as the premier, and Catherine Conroy is the Minister of Finance, had a surplus budget of about close to $6 billion. And
right.
Today, I believe it is a negative of $4.2 billion. And that is very concerning to me and should be to the rest of the province. Give us some comments about that.
For sure. And I think, it's important not to just look at it from even a numbers point of view, because yes, in the last 8 years, I have grave concerns. I'm a former finance minister. I have grave concerns.
Right.
The NDP government has more than doubled our provincial debt to over $100 billion. The projected deficit just for the upcoming year is projected to be almost $8 billion, which would be the largest deficit in British Columbia history. And there's no plan. They can't even tell you when they might even get back to balanced budgets. So we will have deficits as far as the eye can see. But that is not the most concerning part. The most concerning part to me is that it is tied to the worst results we've ever seen in terms of capital construction and investment, in terms of hospital ER closures. This is particularly brutal in the north and the interior, where we've had 274 emergency department closures already this year. Crime on the streets is at levels that we haven't seen before. The drug crisis gets worse every year. So, when you're spending that much money and getting those kind of results, that is really a glaring red flag, or it should be a glaring red flag for the public.
The other part about it, Kevin, and again, looking at it from the outside in areas that are of concern to me, I'm a businessman. I'm very concerned about business in a general sense, and that BC in particular is from an investor's point of view, is an amazing province with amazing resources, amazing infrastructure, and location vis-a-vis China or Asia, Europe, the United States. We have a huge potential for investment, but in one of the largest economic drivers in the province is the forest industry in particular, and circumstances that have surrounded that, in particular pine beetle and the reduction of the annual allowable cut being one. Forest fires to a certain extent have been very serious, 2018, 2019 in particular, and always are of concern. The other part has been that the intentions paper initially put forward by Premier then John Organ, and I was the only one of industry speaking to it, as I believe it was the right direction, meaning that there should be more involvement of First Nations. We agree with that, and most of the industry agrees with that. The second one with old growth, we agree with that, and the third one in particular was creating more incentives for further manufacturing. The more value we can add to our resources here, that's good for the province, it's good for investment, good for the future. On all three of those steps are important. First Nations are more involved, although we have gone too far in terms of not recognizing First Nations and the benefits to First Nations, but there has to be on the land-based for value for primary manufacturing to exist and to attract capital and investment, there has to be a reasonable expectation of access to fiber. That is one of the areas that is now in jeopardy, where, with all due respect, we have 206 First Nations governments, really, and then one provincial government, which means 207 governments having to make decisions in terms of providing continuity on access to fiber to a forest industry, which are critical to us. One of the biggest economic drivers in the province, used to employ about 180,000 people. Now it's more or less half that, and the pleading further is that it is in the interest of First Nations to preserve the primary forest industry, secondary manufacturing, and further investment in the land base to give us this amazing forest that we have here to create that continuity. And I believe it was mismanaged mainly by, and at the risk of being critical, but critical in particular of our government of today. And there were challenges even with other governments, but we have to look at the longer term stability of access to fiber. There is no reason in the world that we cannot do it, and it has to be part of government policies between First Nations and the BC government to create that incentive and that climate that allows for investments. Now we are losing a lot of investments in the forest industry are going to other places, but not only the forest industry. If we look at BC and we see the lack of understanding and the lack of continuity and the lack of progressive working together of the different nations in terms of attracting not only investment but also entrepreneurship, which are critical, is one area of major concern.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I couldn't just disagree with anything you said. I think that the industry, first of all, needs stability, and it needs to have a sense of certainty. Because as you well know, John, capital's not going to invest anywhere where there's uncertainty about whether you'll get a return on investment. And I think that the First Nations can be a wonderful part of the solution, but we also have to align our interests so that First Nations benefit when we all benefit. And that means not just by doing nothing, but by responsibly harvesting and having access to our fiber supply, making sure that we make changes that frankly needed to be made. Even under our government, I don't think we were perfect at all with respect to the forest industry. So there are changes that need to be made, but I think what the current government has really failed on is providing that sense of certainty that those involved in the forestry sector will know that they've got access to this fiber, that they can go and access it, and they can do what they do best. And without that sense of certainty, and with these ever-changing, requirements that are being brought in, new sections suddenly declared as old growth, or new areas that are now off out of bounds for the forestry companies at a whim. It seems these kind of decisions are being made, or permit paralysis, where the government just won't issue permits because they're afraid of upsetting one First Nation or another. And at some point, we have to have leadership that says we have to govern for the benefit of all. That includes Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And we have to make sure we make decisions and issue permits and align interests so that First Nations benefit along with non-First Nation communities. I think we can do that. I think what's missing is the leadership and the will to make decisions.
And it's not at the expense of anybody. In fact, to the contrary,
Right.
because I've had relationships with First Nations for the last 50 years that I've been in business, and but if there are no major investments coming in, or the lack of confidence leaves, not only as it lies to the forest industry, then capital will leave, because there has to be reasonable expectation of access to profitability, and that means in the forest industry access to fiber. It means also to other resources, reasonable continuity of access to the land base, in a responsible way that will benefit First Nations rather than the opposite. It will be, as you indicated, to the benefit of all. That for me would be very important, and it would be very important to you, I believe, as the leader of the BC United Party, and looking forward. And so the other areas that are very much of concern is that the housing is a major issue, has been a major issue of concerns. What do you see? What are we doing now? And what would be, in a short form, your government direction if you became government, different from what we're doing today?
Sure. So first of all, it's important to understand that this NDP government in 2017, the centerpiece of their platform was that they were going to make housing more affordable. And it involved two basic priorities that they identified. One is to build 114,000 affordable homes over 10 years. And the second was that they were going to introduce a new blizzard of taxes onto housing. And they did both, except that the 114,000 homes they promised in 10 years, they only started 16,000, and we're in year 8 of that 10-year plan. They called it the housing hub. We called it the housing flub, because what has happened has just been a hugely disappointing effort. And not surprisingly, because they believe the government is the answer to every question. Yes. And therefore, the results they're getting are very, very poor. Then by adding a bunch of costs to housing, they did nothing to deal with the other element that is important, which is the supply of housing, new supply, encouraging the construction and development of new supply, whether it's rental or market or whatever the case may be. And so the combination of those policies have resulted in the fact that BC now has the most unaffordable housing in the entire country, and the highest average rents in the entire country. So
Right.
the question is, how do we fix it? What we've said is a couple of things. First of all, you if you want more affordable housing, you have to make it less expensive.
Right.
Cannot just keep adding cost to housing and expect it somehow to end up cheaper at the other end. So we are very concerned about first-time buyers in particular, which is why we've said we would eliminate the provincial purchasers tax for all first-time buyers on homes valued up to $1 million.
Right.
That's an important way of making sure that you're not penalizing the people that are trying to actually get into housing.
Right.
Secondly, we've said we would deal with the most challenging issue that people face when it comes to housing, and that is the down payment. Young couples can, just the thought of trying to save up 50 or 75,000 is just almost impossible. Especially
Exactly.
when you're, in Vancouver, your average rent for one bedroom is 3,000 a month. How's a young couple going to save up any down payment? So what we've said is we'd work with the development community, have them put aside 15% of all new projects being built under what's called a rent-to-own basis.
Right.
And government would backstop the developers so that they're financially whole. But in effect, what they would do is be able to sell those units to first-time buyers, negotiate the price, the buyers move in, and they continue to pay market rent while they're living there, equivalent to what they were paying before, say 3,000 a month, for up to 3 years. And the beauty of that is that 100% of the rent will go towards their down payment. And at the end of that 3-year period, typical couple, if they were paying 3,000 a month, would have over $100,000 now put aside for their down payment, and then you get the financial close. So it's a way of identifying some of the key barriers to housing: cost, of course, and down payment. And I think that that coupled with a government that frankly, I'm the only provincial leader that actually has any private sector experience in the housing sector. The
Right.
rest of them haven't got a clue, frankly, what they're doing. And I
Right.
do think that this is a time when we need somebody that actually knows what they're doing.
Yeah, and is being innovative, right? There are certain things that you cannot change, but there is others that you can, that makes access more possible. So the other part of extreme concern in the province is healthcare, in particular access to doctors, nurses. The whole healthcare system has, and I know a lot of docs, I know a lot of people in the field, but they are being so exhausted, so heavily used that subsequently, as you already earlier confirmed, that even emergencies in hospitals, emergency rooms cannot operate because they have the lack of doctors or support staff. And one of the most important parts in somebody's life, especially in the outlying communities, is access to healthcare.
Yeah, this is a huge.
What is
Yeah, this is
your,
a huge.
yeah, sorry, go
Yeah,
ahead.
yeah, it's a huge issue, John, and it's a particularly big issue in rural and northern British Columbia, because I can tell you, in the Lower Mainland, um, it, people here go crazy when we have an emergency department that's on diversion or, in fact, is not open, like Mission Hospital, for example, or the Peace Arch Hospital was almost shut down on
Right.
a weekend, and people went crazy. Well, I can tell you, in rural and northern BC, the level of healthcare inadequacy that people just accept as day to day is frankly just unacceptable.
Yeah,
People are dying. I want to be clear about this. People are dying as a result of not being able to access the kind of healthcare they deserve. Now,
exactly.
I've been around long enough to know that we didn't get into this problem overnight. We won't get out of it overnight. When I first ran in 2001 with Gordon Campbell, the problem we had then was an NDP government that had not added one single new training seat for doctors in the 1990s, because they, in their belief, was that adding more doctors makes the system more expensive, because then you induce more patients, and thus, you're going to have a more expensive healthcare system. That's a crazy philosophy, but that's what they believed. And what we did is we more than doubled the training spaces from 128 to 288. And then we expanded the training up to the University of Northern BC, University of Okanagan, UVic and Victoria, etc. But we still have to do more. And the big opportunity here is that we have hundreds of doctors called international medical graduates. Most of them are BC kids that have gone and studied abroad. They've gotten their medical degree from Ireland or the United States or New Zealand, Australia, and they want to come back to British
Yeah.
Columbia, and we won't let them in. We won't let them in because we've got a lot of rules and regulations that have built up over the last 75 years that say, oh, you can't because the College of Physicians and Surgeons has these regulations. The Ministry of Health has these regulations. The UBC medical program has these rules. Well, you know what I've said? I've said, as somebody that has cut red tape before, I'm going to take a chainsaw through a lot of those rules and regulation, and we're going to bring those young people home because they've all passed their medical, the Canadian medical qualifying exam. They want to practice here. We just have to make sure we've got funded residencies and that we've got proctors or doctors that will, train them so that they can get into the system. We can fix this. We're in the middle of a crisis. And in the middle of a crisis, I tell you, I would not only do that, I would get retired doctors and encourage them, incentivize them to come back and help us while we're training up the new doctors. Same with retired nurses. I would do credential recognition, automatic across the country, so that if you're a doctor or a nurse in Newfoundland, you want to come to BC, come on in. We're not going to make you go through a bunch of paperwork. Come on in. If you're good enough there, you're good enough here. So there are solutions, John. It's just we need leadership.
Yeah, and the key there, Kevin, is as it applies to the forest industry, as it applies to housing, as it applies to healthcare, it's a crisis. It is a crisis. Treated like Rome is burning, and all the stupidity of it around it. And I'm not beating up on the NDP. I hope David Abbey will come and join me virtual for a podcast, to exchange these ideas. But too much bureaucracy is not healthy. I don't care what your persuasion is, left, right, center, or whatever. But it's a crisis. Rome is burning. And with healthcare, housing, all those fundamental things are critically important. Now, the other part that...
Yeah. Can I say something about that, John? Because I think what you said is so important. Because I agree with you, actually, surprisingly. I don't even want to say this isn't because the NDP are bad people or that they've consciously gone out of their way to try and destroy a healthcare system. I think it's just it's a poor skill set. They don't have the right skill set to manage a large, complex enterprise known as government. And, because few, if any of them, come from the private sector. And so what they don't understand is they don't understand how to execute, how to hold people accountable for results, and to focus on results and outcome. I mean, my God, all they talk about is how much they're spending. I can tell you, it's just not relevant to say that you've increased healthcare spending by X billions of dollars. It's not how much you're putting in, it's what you're getting out. And that's what they don't understand. They don't understand that we have to focus on the outcomes that we're getting. And the outcomes we're getting right now in British Columbia are the worst we've ever seen. We're sending cancer patients down south to the United States. We have not seen that in over 20 years since the last time the NDP were in power. We got 1 in 5 British Columbians that can't access a family physician. We've got 1 million people on wait lists trying to get into a surgical procedure, and we've got 274 emergency closures already, and we're only in August.
And there are people that are qualified, willing to work, but because of bureaucrats, they cannot fit in for whatever reason. And exactly. I believe from a political perspective, especially if there is ambitions or whichever the group is, those should be the key areas that they're being focused on. Now, the other part, Kevin, is that for most people now looking at the parties in British Columbia, is that in particular looking at it from the left or the right or the people in the independents in the center are saying, how do we change the government? But then we have the United and the Conservatives. A lot of people like the conservative direction. So the last information that I saw, NDP being at about 42%, Conservatives at 39%, United at about 10%, and the Greens at 8%. So as we get to the election, is there any direction or being discussed, and I'm not asking for any secrets, about should the right of center parties like Conservatives and United work together on becoming the party in power on October the 19th?
Yes, they should. There's no question. Look, I have spent a good chunk of my adult life either supporting free enterprise policies or participating directly as an MLA. There's nobody that cares more about this province, frankly, and the need to unite the center right to make sure that the left doesn't win as a result of stupid vote splitting than me. But I will also say that you have to be very careful with polls. You started out the interview right at the beginning by talking about what was happening in Europe and the United States, and you can see how quickly things change in the United States after the attempted assassination of President Trump. It looked like for several weeks after, like this is done and dusted. He was going to win for sure,
Yeah.
right? That
Yeah.
famous photo of him with his fist in the air, etc. But then what happened? Biden steps aside, Kamala Harris comes on board, and suddenly there's just a complete change in direction. And things can change very quickly. You saw that in Europe too, where the extreme right was the extreme right was supposed to win the European elections. They came third in
UK.
The UK. Yeah, well, that followed more. The polls were more accurate in UK in predicting at least that
Yeah.
there would be a big upset. But I guess what I'm saying is you have to be so careful about polls. They are notoriously wrong. You and I both know in 2013, when I didn't run in that election, that for the 2 years prior, the BC Liberals and BC Conservatives were tied in the polls. Sometimes the BC Cons were ahead. And that's mostly because of confusion between the federal party and the provincial party. Now, what typically happens, and by the way, 2 weeks before the election was called, the BC Liberals are 23 points behind the NDP. Every single pundit and pollster said that the BC Liberals were going to lose that election. There was not a single one that said we had any chance. Now, I didn't run in that election, but I supported my old team.
Right.
And I remember telling my business friends, just would you stop whining and complaining and giving up on the fact that I said the election hasn't even started. And when the election did start, guess what? We ended up winning majority government again. Surprised all the pundits and pollsters. Now, here's what's different this time. The BC Conservatives have really gotten the wind in their sails as a result of the confusion between the federal party and the provincial. There is no relationship between the two. And
No.
I think the biggest challenge, we've tried to come to an agreement with with John Rustad. I know John well. You do too, John.
Yeah.
John's not a bad person.
No.
But I think the challenge, as I always say, is that this election is, and I won't feel, we're not going to end up at 10%. I guarantee you that. But even if we end up at 20% or 25%, I won't be happy. I won't be happy unless the NDP have lost. So I think we do have to be smart about this election. But I think candidate quality really matters. You talked about healthcare. We've recruited several doctors that are running for us. We have, trained locomotive engineers who are Teamster members. We've got teachers. We've got entrepreneurs. We've got a balance of experience like Shirley Bond and folks like that, Todd Stone, Peter Millibar, myself, and new candidates of very high quality. It's very uneven quality in the BC Conservatives, to say the least. I mean, their candidate for Prince George Mackenzie has been in the news just in the last couple of days.
Right.
She's posted things that suggest that 5G cell towers are genocidal weapons that caused COVID, and that what's the other thing? The credit cards are a sign of the Antichrist, and the rapture is coming. Well, like those are not candidates that are going to be able to solve the big challenges we face in this province around natural resources and healthcare and all the rest of it. So I do think that when this election rolls around, people will look at policies, candidates, and at leadership. And I think that we can see a very, very fast, quick realignment if John Rustad's team keeps popping up candidates like this, which I think they will.
So I believe it is important for me to have a podcast with John Rustad. We have invited him. So far, I haven't heard from him. But if I don't, I have to I have a discussion with him in an open chair. And I would not like to do that. I know John. I've known him probably for 30 years at least. But to have a podcast like you are doing is very important. And The other part about it is, Kevin, that is so critical, not only healthcare, housing, but so many of the policies, bloated bureaucracy to the point where it is out of control, is that, and if I look at the industry, not only forest industry, but the capital coming into the province, look and searching for stability and then access to whatever resources and reasonable expectation of that, and a government at least that is supportive, working with First Nations and in other interest groups. I look at Fort Nelson, Fort St. John, Chetwynd, Fraser Lake, Houston, and they have lost thousands and thousands and thousands of lost. And so, again, I say, politically speaking, and from an investment perspective, is that it is a crisis in numerous areas. And we have to take a very, very close look as where do we go from here in terms of October the 19th becomes critical for the leaders of the different parties to articulate to the public in the broadest sense their policies, the reasons why, and what direction they are going. And I hope that John Rustad and David Hibby will also be on my podcast, but if not, we will keep speaking about the issues that are close to my heart as well as an independent. I love British Columbia. I think it's paradise. It is an amazing place for investment and still has an amazing future ahead. But right now, we are in crisis, and the next election is going to be critical.
It is. And, if you just think about, I always remind people of this. The three largest projects taking place in British Columbia right now are the Site C Dam, the twinning of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, and, of course, the LNG pipeline and the facility in Kitimat. All three of those projects were started and initiated by a BC United government, then called BC Liberals. And all three of those projects were opposed very strenuously by the current NDP government. But the reason I mention that is because all three are coming to an end almost simultaneously.
Yeah.
And they represent, all three of those projects, over $100 billion of capital investment alone, not to mention the tens of thousands of very high-paying jobs for mostly Northerners in rural British Columbia. But of course, there's lower mainland benefits too. But, what really, really concerns me is that those three projects have held up this government, this NDP government. 80% of the incremental GDP growth in British Columbia has been a direct result of those three projects. Where would we be today if those projects weren't in place? Where would the tens of thousands of jobs, all of them paying six-figure incomes, which make a big difference in Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities right up and down that corridor, where would they all be now? And what worries me the most is there's not three major projects behind them. There's not even one. The NDP used to talk about a battery plant in Prince George. And I used to say to EB, just because a company expresses an interest, that's a long way away from actually getting the money and investing it and making things happen. And then the NDP government, because they don't understand business, tried to extort the company to say, well, you got to pay for all the power costs that are going to have to be, allocated to this, this battery site. And sure enough, the company just, about a month and a half ago said, well, we're out of here. We're not investing in BC. So the one big project that they used to like to talk about just disappeared.
Out of the window.
That's a real worry.
And the other reality is, just touching on the federal side, obviously from what I know and what I see, is the federal Liberals are not popular. And federally, we are drifting by public opinion, at least in my mind, to more of a right of center next government likely, and that's not necessarily helping the BC United, although they disconnected from the name Liberal. They are now more appropriately called United, likely, but it's probably causing a bit of difficulty. But I believe to find ways and working out a combination between the Conservative and the United Party and between their leaders would be critical for the province, and to again give confidence to capital that BC is stable, reasonable expectation of success if you invest. Because most people love to be here, even capital, because all the key elements we have. But we need to have stability in terms of leadership and the political parties.
Yeah. No, I agree. I've never, for once, and never will say that we shouldn't try to work together. And so my door always is open, and we're always willing to try and find a way. Because at the end of the day, I should say, I know the enemy to me is not John Rustad. I mean,
No.
not at all.
No.
To me, it's David Eby. I do think though that John just has to make sure he's careful, because 55% of the seats in this province are going to be won and lost in the Lower Mainland.
Exactly.
And it's really, really difficult, if you've got a leader of a major party like John that denies climate change is even real, that it's not human caused and there is no crisis. That's a really tough message in the Lower Mainland. And
Yes.
and the polls are it's mostly confusion. People don't know that BC United is the former BC Liberals. That's our bad. That was
Right.
the rebranding effort. The folks that were handling that effort really wanted to emphasize don't talk about the old brand, just talk about the new one. Well,
Right.
I think that connection is important to the public. So
Right.
we're working to deal with that. But look, at the end of the day, I know exactly who the real enemy is, and that's the NDP. And I've never lost sight of that, and I never will.
Kevin, it was a privilege and a pleasure to have you on my podcast. We are watching the political parties closely. I hope that John Rustad will come on my podcast, and so does David Eby. The Greens already have suggested they will, and then we'll share it with our people from around Canada and BC in particular. Kevin, it was a privilege, and we'll stay in touch.
Thank you, John. Thank you for doing this, by the way. And I'll try and be hopeful that they will show up. But I got to tell you, based on my experience, they're trying to avoid debates. They're trying to avoid having any discussions publicly. They're all trying to play it safe. And frankly, I'm the only leadership candidate that goes and has town halls with hundreds of people and takes any question, good, bad, or indifferent. I don't care.
I respect you for that, but if they don't, there will be an empty chair, there will be an interview. They just have to make sure there is a butt in that chair.
Good. Well, let's hope they do it. They should, and I hope they do. Thank you for doing this, John.
Excellent, Kevin. Take care.